exegesis, eisegesis, and biblical interpretation on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, today we're going to talk about exegesis, eisegesis, and the roles it plays in biblical interpretation. Now, exegesis means to draw out of a text what it really means. Eisegesis means to read into the text what you want it to mean. Now, these are not exactly specific to biblical interpretation, although we do find discussions of exegesis and eisegesis being referred to a lot in the Bible. But these things can be applied to any text. We can apply it even to, say, modern texts. Let me give you an example. René Descartes, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, dating to 1639, says, and I quote, "Yet, although the senses sometimes deceive us about objects that are very small or distant, that doesn't apply to my belief that I am here, sitting by the fire, wearing a winter dressing gown, holding this piece of paper in my hands," and so on. Now, you could read into this text that René Descartes wore women's clothing. He's wearing a winter dressing gown. That is a form of eisegesis. You're taking a preconceived notion, a bias or a presupposition, and you're reading it back into an older text or a text where the context may not apply. So here we have, a piece of early modern philosophy that the same sort of textual methods can be applied to. Now, if we use proper exegesis on this passage, we would say that both men and women at this period of time wore dressing gowns when they went to bed. So that was just the manner of dress that was common at that period of time. So when we talk about exegesis and eisegesis, what we're talking about is reading methods that can be applied to practically any text. Any text can be read for exegesis and it can be read for eisegesis. Now, we have to kind of understand here that when we talk about eisegesis here, what we're talking about here is a manner of reading that is generally considered illegitimate. Now, in the past, it was considered to be more favorable, and we'll get into that later in the video. But today, we now consider this to be taking someone's words as they weren't presented. But in the case of, say, when we start applying exegesis and eisegesis to the Bible, it becomes a little more problematic because we don't actually have the cultural context of the Bible through which we can automatically determine whether something is exegesis or eisegesis. So this is where careful reading methodology plays a part. And we have to always ask the question, are we reading the text as it purports itself to be, or whether is what we want to read in the text showing through in our reading? Michael Heiser once said of exegesis that good exegesis begins with asking questions of the text. Now, we are going to take a couple of examples here from biblical texts to show us sort of the difference between exegesis and eisegesis as it applies to the Bible. The first text we are going to take is 2 Chronicles 27, 1 through 2. And the text reads, "Jotham was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all his father Uzziah had done. However, he did not enter the temple of the Lord, but the people continued acting corruptly. Okay. Now, let's take this text and let's apply a little bit of eisegesis. There have been sermons that have done exactly this with this particular text, which is to say that Jotham was pretty much was a pretty good king, except he didn't go to church. You see, it says here right in the text, he did not enter the temple of the Lord. So he was good, but he didn't go to church. So therefore, this is a text saying that it's a good thing that you should go to church, because this was considered to be a strike against Jotham. Now, that is actually eisegesis. That is reading a presupposition into the text or confirming a bias using this text. Because when we look at, say, the earlier passage of 2 Chronicles 26:16, it tells us exactly what is being meant by he did not enter the temple of the Lord. And we read from that text, quote, "But when he, Uzziah, became strong, his heart was so proud that he acted corruptly, and he was unfaithful to the Lord his God. For he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense." So, what we can see from, say, the previous text, which is the context of 2 Chronicles 27:1-2, is that Jotham acted more holy than his father Uzziah because he didn't go into a temple, the place where he didn't belong, because the kings of Israel were not permitted to act as priests. So he didn't enter into the temple, he did not burn incense in an unholy and sacrilegious manner, and he was not puffed up with pride in the same way his father was. So that's the example here of exegesis, where you are taking the text in its context and pulling out the proper meaning of the text. So the however in 2 Chronicles 27:1-2 is that he entered the temple, he did not enter the temple, he respected the Lord's boundaries, he respected the laws of the Lord, and thus acted in a more holy manner. Okay, now let's take another example. Exodus 13:2, and that text reads, "Sanctify me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both of man and beast, it belongs to me." Now, I have seen secular liberal scholars take this text and say, well, here we have the proof of child sacrifice among the Israelites. See? Sanctify. Well, a burnt offering is sanctified. Therefore, the firstborn of every human and donkey is being put up as a burnt offering. This is eisegesis because it ignores the fact that both man and beast can be redeemed with a redemption fee and is to be redeemed. So this text is actually saying the opposite of the whole child sacrifice motif. It is actually saying that you are not to give your firstborn to Yahweh as a child sacrifice. You are to redeem them instead. So those scholars who try to make this the pretext for child sacrifice are actually sort of flipping the text on its head by reading what they want into the text without referring to any other text as they do so. That's eisegesis. Okay, now I'm going to give you one final example of how to do good exegesis, which is from Exodus 4:19. Now, the text says, "Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, 'Go back to Egypt, for all the men who are seeking your life are dead.'" Now, I've discussed this text in the past, so this shouldn't be a big surprise to my viewers. However, this is an example of good exegesis versus poor exegesis, or even eisegesis, which is we can start asking this text certain questions. And that question that pops to mind here is, well, how many people wanted Moses dead? This text is often interpreted to say that, well, Pharaoh was the one who wanted Moses dead, and he was the one being referred to as having died. But if we read this passage carefully, we notice here that the phrase all of the men in the plural, we're using a grammatical feature here, which is the number of the noun. Is the noun in the singular? Is the noun in the dual, meaning it represents two people? Or is it many people, as in men? So here we look at this, and we can see here that there were many people that wanted Moses dead. Not just one person, and not just Pharaoh. Moses, when he had killed the Egyptian taskmaster, had made many enemies in Egypt. And this text reflects that. And this is proper exegesis, where we use the grammar and the text to bring out more information, bring the text out into its fullness. So those are our examples of exegesis and eisegesis. Now, we do see some common applications of eisegesis in literature. We see this, one of the most grievous offenders of this of eisegesis is among newspaper prophecy preaching. Basically, where preachers take current events and then try to apply them to biblical prophecies. There's an assumption when people do this that ancient prophecies were intended for modern readers. Trying to correlate modern events according to fulfillment of prophecy leads to subjective eisegesis of the biblical texts. Essentially, when you scour the biblical text looking for modern fulfillment of that, you are essentially taking your bias and reading it back into the text. So it is eisegesis. But I want to conclude by saying that this is also not a new problem. The allegorical method of reading a text that was popularized by Philo and Origen is also historically a great offender of this. Now, what the allegorical method is it basically takes the biblical text, doesn't matter what biblical text it is, and reads it as an allegory. You're changing the meanings of words to basically tell, sometimes some people say, deeper truth of the allegory of the text. However, in doing this, the allegorical method normally ignores the intended meaning of the text and very, very quickly degenerates into eisegesis. Essentially, what the allegorical reader does is he reads his own message, his own meaning into the text through the allegory, but doesn't read the meaning of the text as the text purports itself to be. So it becomes also eisegesis. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something from it. And I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.